Hello, folks. I hope you've had a chance to listen to Alec Guinness reading Burnt Norton. I'm going to pick up these comments right where we left off. We had talked about the first part of the poem, and we'll begin now, or I'll begin by talking a bit about the second part. As I mentioned in class, no one quite knows what to make of the opening stanza. It's unusual to say the least, especially those first two lines. Garlic and sapphires in the mud, clot the bedded axle tree. Why garlic and sapphires? Well, you can sort of see garlic as sort of an earth-hugging lotus. Just as the lotus sits on water, the garlic sits atop the earth. It's multiformed like the lotus flower. Sapphires, I don't know, but in Exodus 24, the Israelites have a vision of God on a sapphire pavement going up into the heavens. So this whole stanza is a mix. There are multiple contrasts throughout this stanza. You've got living garlic and lifeless gem. You've got motion and stasis. You have hunter and hunted, with the boarhound and the boar. And important to this stanza is the notion of a pattern, things being appeased, reconciled. There are patterns within patterns here, and we talked about this last time. The importance to this vision, or this attempt at a vision, the importance of finding form and pattern in human life. So this feeling of being appeased, reconciled, prefigured under the stars, this implied sense of order in kind of the muck and confusion of ordinary life. This leads to the vision in the next stanza of the cosmic order, the still point. This section began with an earthly still point, a kind of negative stasis, the image of the axle, a wheel that's stuck in the mud. In the next stanza, we move to a cosmic vision of a still point, a point where motion and stasis are reconciled, where becoming and being are one. Notice how that point is defined by negatives. It's neither flesh nor fleshless. It's still, but it can't be called fixed. It sustains all movement. It sustains a dance. Without the still point, there would be no dance. Then after about 8 lines, the thoughts move from the cosmic to the psychological. I can only say, there we have been. Well, we ask ourselves, where? And, well, he can't say where, but we can speculate that he's talking about a condition of the soul that he has a strong sense once existed. Is this Eden? Is it pre-existence? Is this life in the womb? Whatever it is, it's a vision of utter and complete happiness, a freedom from anxiety and fear. It's there's a sense of prevailing grace, a grace of sense, A white light still and moving, Erhebung, meaning loftiness or exaltation, without motion, concentration without elimination. After this vision sort of runs its course, he pulls back from it. It's again this notion that humankind cannot bear too much reality, and our aging bodies and minds protect us from such vision, or deny our ability to sustain such a vision. What we have in our absence are those moments that we've encountered earlier in the poem, the moment in the rose garden, and other moments like those. In the last session, someone called them epiphanies, and indeed, that's what they are. So through time, through holding on to these moments as the still point in a kind of a psychic sense, or psychological sense, I should say, he can conquer time by sustaining that vision, that memory. The third section of Burnt Norton takes us into a place of disaffection, the London Underground. And the description is reminiscent of other city descriptions in Eliot's poetry. The yellow, smoky atmosphere of Prufrock City and the unreal city of the wasteland, where a kind of death in life presides. The same sort of thing happens here. This is a world filled with impurities. It is neither light nor dark. There's neither plenitude nor vacancy. Notice he uses the same syntax to define the still point as he uses to define its very antithesis, the underground. It is he calls it ironically a twittering world, a world where people are distracted from distraction by distraction. A wonderful characterization of what it's like to be in a city for the first time. If you think back to the time you first saw Times Square, you're just bombarded by sensations, ads, faces, bits of conversation. They overwhelm the senses. Men and bits of paper are indistinguishable in this underworld. And the wind blows both men and bits of paper about. Polluted air comes into and out of unhealthy lungs. The first section here, the first stanza, ends with mention of subway stops along the underground in London. Then there is a command to descend lower. Descend only into the world of perpetual solitude. Well, in the Inferno, Virgil urges Dante to go deeper in the underworld. And what Eliot talks about in the final stanza of this section is a kind of dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross was a 16th century Spanish monk and poet who wrote a poem called The Darkness of the Soul, the Dark Night of the Soul. And the whole notion is that to achieve a purer self, you must empty yourself of all ego, all desire, all impurities, and that will bring you closer to spiritual fulfillment and happiness. And this is largely what it's kind of a thought experiment going on here. He's imagining how he could go deeper, go beyond the obvious negativity and ugliness of this setting, deeper into himself, a world, go into a space of denial, and thereby achieve some level of purification. In contrast to the ordinary blokes who are riding the subway in appetency, on the metal ways of the world, that is, in linear, unregenerate time. The fourth section of Burnt Norton is very different in style and tone from the other sections. For one thing, it's quite brief. It's also written in a more formal manner. There's end rhymes that you didn't find very often at all in other parts of Burnt Norton. And the opening kind of has echoes of Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The poem does announce the passage from daylight and into evening. There's suggestions of death and burial going on. It's as though it is set in a churchyard. The dead are speaking from their graves, looking up towards sunflowers and so on, wondering if they would bend and turn toward us. And the yew tree, whose chill fingers reach down to them, is traditionally planted in graveyards. But the little this brief interlude does end with the kingfisher's wing, which is the kingfisher is often taken as a symbol of Christ. And even though the world is moving into darkness, the light is still at the still point of the turning world. Part 5 of Burnt Norton begins, words move, music moves, only in time. Thought and music depend on the passing of ordinary time. But he then moves on to argue that the forms and patterns of language and music are more lasting. And that leads to an image of a Chinese jar that is moving perpetually in its stillness. And that image of the jar is kind of a pivotal moment in Burnt Norton. He's reaching the idea that the forms and patterns of art, in their persistence, their everlastingness, enable the coexistence of opposites like sound and silence, beginning and end, which coexist in time. And their persistence in time is eternal. So at this point of the poem, he reaches a kind of resting point where the temporal becomes eternal. And he's able to say that the end and the beginning were always there, and all is always now. And so this is kind of a breakthrough moment in the poem where he has, intellectually at least, redeemed time. He then sets out to work with language. And he has the passage, words strain, crack, and sometimes break. Notice that in the fifth part of this poem and the fifth part of East Coker and Little Gidding, he begins with a critique. The first stanza includes a critique of language, the imprecision of language, how meanings change. And the poet's struggle is the struggle with a very difficult language, words and meanings. And words are slippery. And he then reaches another kind of still point in his argument as he wrestles with language and moves from the many words and their many meanings to the word in the desert. That is an idea of Christ attacked by the temptations when he's in the wilderness. And the next stanza, or the second stanza of part 5, Burnt Norton, begins, the detail of the pattern is movement, as in the figure of the 10 stairs. That figure of speech, that symbol, the 10 stairs, is an explicit reference to St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish poet and monk that I mentioned earlier. The 10 steps in the ladder, it's kind of a Platonic image of mystical love that progresses from earthly love up to a union with God. So he begins with the idea of movement in the effort to find the persistent form. Desire is movement. There's movement up the stairs. And then love. Love is itself unmoving. It is now the still point. So having reached this kind of intellectual still point with reconciling time and eternity, and then reconciling appearing to reconcile words with the word, he's now dealing more with the heart, trying to find that, again, recalling that moment in the rose garden and other moments like it that persist in his memory because of the persistence of love. Love being the cause and end of movement, timeless and undesiring. And this thought of love seems to awaken the children in the garden. Sudden in a shaft of sunlight, even while the dust moves. Remember the dust. Why disturb the dust in a bowl of rose leaves, he asks. Well, now the dust is moving, the hidden laughter of children in the foliage, and he hears the bird calling again, quick now, here now, always. And we're reminded of the double meaning of quick. I mean, hurry up, and also just being alive, the quick and the dead. And the poem ends with two lines that you could look at in two ways. One is that from this still point of the rose garden, ordinary time, linear time, unredeemed time, looks ridiculous and sad, stretching before and after. The other is to say, you know, this is a vision lost. The poem ends on kind of a sour note in that case. I feel strongly both ways. Now, I included in your readings the fifth part of East Coker and Little Gidding, just to give you a sense of the whole. I knew that four quartets in its entirety was too rich a meal for one sitting. So I just included these parts, and the fifth part of each quartet is always the most affirmative. And I love the part 5 of Little Gidding East Coker, largely because when he talks about the process of aging, this is very much Eliot speaking in his own voice, without any mask on. And he says, home is where one starts from. As we grow older, the world becomes stranger, the pattern more complicated of dead and living. And, you know, he was only in his late 50s when he wrote this, but it's a feeling I think anyone of a certain age certainly can identify with, how our dead friends and our loved ones occupy our daily thoughts and also occupy our dreams. It's as though as you age, you are living in two worlds at once. And I think in this stanza, he really effectively expresses that feeling. In Little Gidding, the most memorable moment is the ending itself, where he imagines the rose and ends with, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, when the tongues of flames are enfolded into the crown knot of fire, and the fire and rose are one. This is probably a reference to the Pentecost, when tongues of fire rested on the heads of the disciples, and they began speaking in tongues. This notion of the animated, eternal rose that is also a flame is rather a dramatic and powerful conclusion to his meditation and his anticipation or hope for obtaining a vision of the eternal and the temporal, and the word within the words.